So good morning. This is going to be a joint presentation. It actually was billed as a panel with Irene and Steve and myself. And so we're going to follow the slides that Irene presented before she had to leave, and then go into some of the details of the study, and then talk a little bit more about where we think the study will move before it's finalized. So these are preliminary results out of the work that has been done over the last year and a half in terms of collecting a lot of information and trying to understand it. I will say, before we get into that, that by looking at all this information, it has occurred to us that this is a more complicated, complex subject than maybe it was originally envisioned about how just to come up with best practices for how the industry and public sector organizations can interact, can support each other, can make great progress. So it actually may spin off additional, more focused activity as we go forward with that. But and I have to admit that I'm picking up this topic from all the work Steve and IDC and now Hyperion, is that right? Hyperion has done for us under first funding from NSF to NCSA, and then NCSA funding to IDC. And I also want to acknowledge Merle Giles, who was actually at NCSA and started this study off about a year and a half ago, and then I picked it up about 6 months ago to try to put the finishing touches on it. So. As I say, you stand on the shoulders of giants, right? So let me turn this over to Steve to talk about the first set of results, some of the data that's been collected, and some of the methodology, and then I'll come back and try to draw some of the some of the initial conclusions and some of what we think are best practices. And as Irene said, we believe these best practices span different models of ways of having engagement, and we'll be expanding on that as well. So, Steve.
Sure. Thanks, Bill. Yeah, so the idea was to collect best practices and to do that on a worldwide basis, not U.S. only basis. Best practices in partnerships between especially publicly funded HPC centers and industrial users, and we say very deliberately users because many more centers have worked with HPC vendors. The real goal here is to look at the side where they're working with users and providing access to users. And so we really wanted to look at the whole sort of ecosystem that they're working with, starting with the legal and IP kinds of environments that they're operating in, governance frameworks in the terminology that we used with them. But it is, as Irene said, this is really a survey-based, sort of experiential kind of a study where we really wanted to capture their experiences more than we wanted to capture the chapter and verse of the language of their governance frameworks and so forth. We really wanted to see how they reacted to those, how they felt things were going, how effective those were. And then to kind of narrow that down to things that seem to be working across multiple centers pretty well and why, in order to come up with a checklist of practices, not for any center to adopt wholesale, but to consider, because these are things that tend to work well, especially when you know which environments they work well in and which not. And then a remaining piece, which we haven't finished yet, is to do the section that kind of zeroes in on what does this mean in particular to NSF and the NSF community that Irene talked about there. So right now we have done in-depth interviews, and they really were long interviews, 2 to 3 hours each typically, with 35 centers in the US and around the world, and 31 industrial partners. And we're looking toward publication in a couple of months here. So the key trends that we saw driving this based on the results are definitely, and I guess this is a good thing, is that And we kind of know this from other studies that we've done recently, is that HPC has kind of moved up a rung to a higher level of political discourse around the world. In the last few years, you kind of saw some few hints of that even in the talks this morning. I sort of asked about ECP and international participation, no. And I think you'll find the same thing with the European ones. If you say American and Asian participation, no. So it really is with, even though this is not focused particularly on exascale, the forward direction is kind of the gunfight at OK Corral. So it really is kind of shaping up to be a battle down the road here among geographies in the world. And particularly outside of the US, there really are, as HPC is being seen as more strategic, not just for science, but for economies, we're seeing governments pushing hard in Europe and in Asia to develop domestic supply chains and to sort of cast off or curtail reliance on foreign sources for HPC technology. One of the most important findings is that wherever we went in interviewing centers, science remains the primary focus. That's very, very important to state. But having said that, more and more of the centers are doing more things with industry. And in conjunction with that, trying to grow their expertise in domains that make sense. We're working with industry. And marketing and PR are becoming much more important in that. These are the four main types that we saw. We centers that that do science only and don't have members of the scientific teams from industry. That's one category. Others that do, where the PI invites some folks from industry in. A third one where they're doing both open science and open private sector research. And then a variation of that where they also do closed or proprietary research with companies, and some variations on that theme as well. So we asked about what are you getting out of these partnerships? And for industry, and of course it varied. The industry sees things a little bit differently. For them, as we'll see, the most important benefit stated was competitiveness, increased competitiveness. For HPC centers, a couple of surprises, at least for us. One of them that was stressed by a lot of the centers working with industry is, working with industry, we see new ways of doing science, the science that is central to our missions. And also, they said, quite a few of our scientific staff, not to mention our computational staff, really get a kick out of working with industry on kind of real-world problems like that. So it's an extra motivation. And then a smaller number said, it's paid access, we also get to invest more in the center. And echoing that, you can see the circled area there for some of the differences in perspective, that competitiveness for, and I hope you can read that, it's kind of small, but competitiveness for the industrial partners was the absolute key, and that closely aligns with product development in this case. But discoveries, faster development are important for both. Satisfaction.
Can you explain the two different color blues?
Oh, sure.
Which one's just industry?
Yeah, sorry, because you may not be able to read it. The darker blue are responses from the HPC centers, the lighter blue from the industrial partners. So there's kind of a fair alignment there, but some really big differences, particularly when it comes to that competitiveness one. I mean, as you would expect, the centers aren't so much as concerned with competitiveness as the industrial partners that use them are. Satisfaction, you can just kind of like grok that pattern there, the whole thing. You can see that satisfaction levels are high for both the centers and the partners in general, and dissatisfaction levels toward the bottom there are pretty low.
In the scales of 1 to 10.
Yeah, and it's a scale of 1 to 10, and I think the actual average rating, we're pretty similar though. The average rating from the centers was 8.54 on a scale of 10, where 10 was absolutely ideal satisfaction. So pretty high. For the industrial partners, it was the reverse, or 8.45, so in the same zone. Very, very high levels of satisfaction. Results compared with their initial expectations, you can see that for a majority of the ones, at least those interviewed so far, and these are preliminary findings, exceeded expectations. And more important, very few fell short of the expectations that people had. And this is just a harder to read eye chart of specific areas of results compared with expectations. And it's kind of like when we ask the centers, what do you think are the biggest benefits coming out of these partnerships to the industrial partners? That's how the question was phrased. And they said, well, we think that the biggest things that we're offering them are access to advanced technologies. And it's true. I mean, that's also what the partner said. So there was, the main takeaway from this graph here for these results are that there was a pretty good alignment between the center's responses and the industrial partnership responses when it comes to specific areas of satisfaction here. And this tells a lot. Just we asked the question, we talk about the value of these industrial partnerships, and you can see the results there. Almost everything is very valuable. And I don't think, since these were deliberately anonymous interviews, I don't think we were getting just motherhood and apple pie responses. People were pretty frank in lots of other ways, in detail. Bill, do you want to? Sure. And this is the forward and backward.
So we do think that there are some valid early best practices that we can call out from the information we have. The report actually is about a 90-page report as it currently stands. And there's much more in the report in terms of the questions and responses that are there. I think there were 45 areas that Steve and others did during their survey for both the industrial partners and the academic or HPC partners. So a lot of additional information is there in addition to quotations and or specific commentary on why the ratings were that way. So we're really just summarizing things. But the first maybe the most important best practice is for HPC centers or even other types of industrial engagement. It's very important, maybe the best, most important thing, to have those centers take the industry work that they're doing very seriously. So this is not something you want to do and just say, oh, yeah, I want to check off a box and say I have some industry research or activities going on. So you want to take that very seriously. And this includes providing support for the industrial users that is explicitly part of the center mission, or at least acknowledged in terms of how the center is organized, how they're staffed, and how they pay attention to that. Is it a strategic part of the center's activities? And what you'll see is the centers that have made that decision to take this very seriously, other ones that are showing the very high satisfactions or the relationships. If industry is using your systems, then it's important to take their requirements into account when you're provisioning services and systems, buying services and systems. So we do that when we have science users. We have all our science cases. You saw for ECP, Paul presented some of the driving science areas for ECP as they go through their co-design. We have to have the same type of thing for our industry partners if we're going to make this highly successful on an organization basis. Focus on not doing everything or not thinking you can do everything. Focus on supporting industry in the domains that the center has expertise and experience in. So yes, you want to grow and expand your expertise. That makes a lot of sense. But if you're going to be successful, you have to focus on the things that you already have in your center that have the core expertise, and then you can grow from there. So don't try to be something for everybody. You just say, oh, I can do anything for anybody if you want a successful relationship. Hire at least some experienced business personnel to lead the center's programs. This is because there is a cultural difference, and you'll see this on a slide later, cultural difference between the way people in industry work and the way people in HPC or academic or national lab research centers work. And bridging that cultural difference is a responsibility of making these partnerships work. So having people that can have experience on both sides, but it may not be as productive to take somebody out of an academic research career and say, okay, now you have to support industry. You want that expertise, but you have to have some balance to make these cultures work. And the last one is making sure that if it's part of your key mission, if it's something that you want as a center to succeed in, you have to put good staff on that. So it's not a second string activity. You have to have good staff to work with the industry partners, because in general, they will put their good staff on. This is a big investment for them. So these are some of the things about taking the industry activity seriously, and you would see that in the cases of what's there. So other aspects kind of along the same line, have your center staff understand that this is very important to the center. It's not just an add-on, and that kind of needs to span all of the activities that the center is doing, including stuff that is supporting the science there. We should have our public funding stakeholders encourage expanding the missions of centers to incorporate industry activity. You see that in terms of ECP, for example, the Industry for Council or whatever that was called. Similar things exist in the NSF space, so those all are very helpful to take into account making this work. And I think the rest is similar to the one before. Okay. So the next one is providing opportunities to do both open and proprietary research. So in many of the groups studied, there was the ability for industrial partners to participate in the open research. In the Blue Water system that I'm most familiar with, people can, or organizations, industrial organizations can and have applied for allocations through the open process, the peer review process, and go forward with that. I know that exists in a number of other places. So that's one way that industry can participate and make use of these resources. The other suggestion is also have mechanisms for doing non-public research. And we have that going on as well on the Blue Water system and many of these other organizations that were in the survey. So having the ability to do both and working with the industrial partners so that they can achieve both is an important aspect of successful activities. Now, it's not simple to be able to do this, and in various different locales around the world, it becomes more complex of how do you have government-funded activities, systems being used for-profit organizations. But I think that there's ways to work around that. So one of the things that probably would be good to understand is how do people interpret those rules to make best practices for doing that for the future. With that. But there is a corresponding need for transparency or public awareness, being able to explain your results. So in some cases, it's difficult if you're going to do something proprietary. Companies normally don't want to even talk about what they're doing. There has to be a give and take in that relationship so that you can say, I'm doing something that is very important industrial-wise. We just completed a project that a summary was announced for ExxonMobil, the largest reservoir simulation we believe was ever done. That's highly proprietary to them, that we're not going to publish, or they're not going to publish how they did it and their algorithms and whatever. But the fact is that they achieved that is very important for us as a center, as well as for ExxonMobil in the community to know, yes, the HPC is important for them making progress. So there has to be a balancing act between that allows some understanding about what is being achieved and accomplished by these industrial partnerships. So I mentioned the cultural gap. Business projects from the survey feedback and our own experiences, and some of you may comment as well. Business projects typically operate on shorter time spans, shorter time frames. They may not want to start something until they start, and then they want to have it done immediately. So they have different cycles that maybe is used to some of the research programs that go on the academic or the national laboratory research areas. So being able to accommodate these differences in time frames is something a center has to be able to do to provide good service to both types of categories of users. Excuse me. And having clear expectations set by both parties is another lesson or best practice that has to be maintained throughout this range of things. So what is expected, both the industrial partners and the centers have to have a give and take, right? So when we go into this, we mentioned the centers need to have some people with business experience, but the industrial components also have to realize they're working in a different environment because typically they're doing something that they can't do in-house normally, so they have to be able to understand that, and the best way to do that is set expectations and communicate frequently between the teams to make sure you maintain this level of understanding throughout the projects. So this slide has to do with how you recruit and make people aware that HPC centers are willing to provide resources to industry. And the first lesson is active marketing in public relations is necessary. That also goes back to the need to be able to say, yes, we're able to do these things for other industry partners. Maybe you're interested in doing something that you can't do in your own in-house systems. But marketing the activities, how this works is a very important aspect of the successful programs that we've seen. Focusing on a small number of domains, at least initially, so that you can achieve high levels of success and satisfaction is another aspect of that. And setting expectations clearly, right? So there are things that maybe industry partners might come in. We have an activity going on right now at NCSA where the industrial requirements, because there's a number of things that are being requested that have to figure out how can they be done, and indeed both sides are changing their processes, their workflows, other aspects to achieve what the goals are for that research. And some of the components of things that are important to include when we're talking about having these joint understandings, clear expectations, and communication are listed down there for your thing, for your information. I won't go through all of it, but those are very important things to have well defined across the staffs that will be appointing, supporting the industrial work. And it's important to have that flow into not just the one point of contact for industry, but for example, the system managers who are running the system. They have to understand some of these expectations, but also be able to say, I don't know if I can meet that expectation that industry has in this regard. Contracts and intellectual property is a challenging area for many of these relationships, and it takes a long time to put in place. So reaching agreement on IP intellectual property is time-consuming. It very much is a case-by-case activity, at least the experiences I've seen. And it has to be a way that both the centers and the academic institutions and the research institutions, as well as the companies, get experience in how to make this work better and more efficiently, but it always is going to be an issue there. So having an umbrella type agreement that allows multiple tasks to happen underneath that framework might be a good thing to put in place. So that it's defined at a higher level. The same for the transparency, right? So, or transparency, or at least the ability to acknowledge this work is going on and things are being accomplished. That can be part of the umbrella agreement so people understand, yes, there will have to be some type of public summary of the work that goes someplace, but I'm not going to disclose the details of the work, things like that. So these agreements take time to put in place. They do vary by organization, and it's not something that's dictated only by, say, the rules of different governments or whatever. So the rules that we operate under in the NSF space are different than the rules I used to operate under in the DOE space or the NASA space. So how those rules are interpreted, how they come out in terms of the arrangements, there will be differences in how that works. So some opportunities now. So those are kind of the best practices so far. Those are initial summary of the preliminary summary of kind of things that span all the information of the successful interactions and relationships that are part of this survey. So kind of the opportunities we have is we're hoping that these best practices, particularly as we get the report finalized and published, can help transfer scientific knowledge and help industrial experience in terms of use of high-performance systems. Providing improved ways of industrial use of our HPC centers in an efficient manner, and building those relationships is another opportunity we have. And just the ability for people that might not normally think of going to a center, a public center, be it in research institutions, academia, or other activities, to know that they can actually go and carry out some of their work that they may not be able to do in-house. I don't think these things work necessarily just to supplement what they're doing in-house on a day-to-day basis. What a lot of these are enhancing new methods, new ways of having companies work in the long run. Public funders, acknowledging that this is a good thing to be doing for research and advanced industrial R&D is a good thing, and these investments are coming out and are appropriate for the return on investment that is being made in these large-scale systems is another activity, and we see that in almost all the programs we see for HPC. Exascale, extreme scale, whatever they are, now have industrial components that we're trying to achieve. So some of the challenges that remain, bridging the cultural gap that separates the perspectives of people coming, and this is at all levels of the organizations, right? What high-level corporate executives may think, what the individual workers may think, because they may have been working in their own environment for and used to how to do that, and a whole new environment is different. In some of the research areas, they're used to working on multiple different centers and migrating from one to the other. That may not be the case in the industrial activities. So a key problem for centers is making sure that the research problems are taken seriously and are actually treated as equal partners with the other scientific and research enterprises. For industrial partners, accepting maybe some of the constraints or the ways of doing business that may not be the way things would happen within their own in-house centers would be it, and then addressing how to come up with good agreements that between the organizations is another challenge. And then the governance and frameworks that may limit collaborations or may make things a little more challenging to reach agreements are things that we should, A, be able to explain and understand why that occurs. so people on both sides of these relationships understand that, and B, try to eliminate the things that are not necessary that stand in the way. But understanding that there are different sources of what these requirements are probably the first step forward. So with this, I'll turn it back over to Steve for some of the other data that we've had accommodated in this study, and then open it for questions.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll go quickly. The whole idea is that we've been talking a lot conceptually, but in the report there are tons of data tables, and this is just one that kind of summarizes the situation. Some of it a little bit surprising that the average length of the partnership's 15 years going on. The average number of businesses that have participated in an industrial program at an HPC data center, nearly 100 businesses over time just for the average. And the number of businesses at any one time, meaning today specifically, that are still participating with one of these centers, average figure 24 businesses. Average duration of a partnership, a little over 3 years. Longest was a little under 10 years. Yeah.
Just a clarification on this slide. What's the difference between average length and average duration?
Sorry. Partnerships in years. Average duration of partnership in years. You know what? I think it's a mistake.
No, I think the first one is average length of partnerships, means how long has the center been involved in partnerships?
You're right.
And average duration of a single partnership.
No, Bob's right. That's what it is. It's the average length of time that a center has been involved. Yep.
So what is the rate?
Thanks, Bob. Yep. But I'm going to go back and check it anyway.
That's why I wanted him to present these numbers.
He gets the easy part, conceptual. And about 2/3 are fine with the governance framework they're operating under, and about 1/3 are not happy with it for one reason or another. And as Bill said, the report is long, so we really have tons of specific comments for all of these about exactly what's right or wrong about their framework. We had to ask, are any of your partners paying? And about 2/3 of them said, yes, we have industrial partners who pay us for use of our center resources. What about access on demand? Do you allow industrial partners to have access on demand, meaning to increase the access or whatever, surge work, whatever? And not too many do. That's a tough one to pull off for most centers. Do you provide technical support? What this means in this context is kind of not with the initial legal contract and so forth, but during the course of the project, paperwork and procedures, explaining how to get through procedures and so forth. Just about all of them do that. Domain expertise, we ask the partners, do they have expertise in your domain? Overwhelmingly, but not universally, the answer is yes. You might want to talk about next steps.
Excuse me. So we have some follow-on activities after having the report reviewed by a few folks that we'll be doing. And we very much appreciate the cooperation and flexibility that Hyperion is working in this report. It's a lot of work, and they've done a great job pulling together the information, but also going back and helping clarify some things. So we will be interviewing more smaller and mid-sized academic centers, mostly in the U.S., to get a better balance, because right now most of the sites were larger scale centers that you may know and come to meetings like this. And we're going to add a section that is mostly relevant to the NSF and U.S. academic community based on that feedback from those types of sites that are involved with that. And then we have to do a final review and a final publication before we release this report. But as Steve mentioned, we're hoping to be able to do that in the next several months. And I think that's questions, right?
Well, I'm going to ask the first one then.
Okay, then we have one over
Great.
there.
I thought your bullets about PR and outreach were right on track and I think really insightful. Can you say anything about how the existing partnerships that you looked at came about? What's the history of these partnerships that you examine now and helping your philosophy and going forward?
Yeah, well,
Here you go. There it is.
It varies a whole lot. Even an extreme example is a European center that is in the category 1 that we showed, science only, no industrial participation in the scientific projects. The PIs don't bring in people from industry and so forth, and kind of pretty proud of that. But it turns out that Earl and I actually visited that center, and we were sort of proudly told that. But then when we started interviewing some people from the center, they said, oh no, there are these 3 gigantic companies that we worked with before we were ever declared a national center, and that provide about 1/4 of our revenue. So you kind of get into situations like that. With a lot of them, like in DOE, for example, you have formal programs like Insight that I think in 2005, if I'm not mistaken, really invited industry in more pervasively. So it really varies a lot. The histories are, they're programmatic histories, and then beyond that, as I think Bill was implying, there are also histories that are specific to every one of the centers that we talked with.
All right, you want to ask? Speak loud.
Speak loud, yeah. So maybe a suggestion for your report. What are the best, you mentioned cross-learning, different industrial partners learning from each other and from the experience. What are the best forums to go for that? I know some supercomputing groups like this, but maybe there are more, and not everybody knows about it.
Well, I will offer that I know a number of the centers actually have some type of annual meeting where they invite their industrial participants, partners together. In the case of NCSA, we have one for all the industrial activities, but we also have another one where we invite the industrial users on Blue Waters to come to our annual symposium. So that's one way to exchange, not just with amongst the industry partners, but also with the rest of the science teams using the system, so they can learn how they might be able to do the technology as well as what they're doing. So I don't know about other ones.
Yeah, I mean, in Europe, PRACE has an annual conference for their industrial partnerships. It's an excellent conference.
Okay, Bill, I have a question, and this really relates to users who only come to the centers for access to systems. There are IRS regulations on unrelated business income. And so if this industrial partner is just using computing resources, wouldn't that be treated as unrelated business income, and how is that handled?
Who is it that is only the cooling guy? I think I'm only the computing guy. But I can't get it. So both my parents were tax accountants, but I don't remember enough about that. So I think that very seldom is somebody coming just to use cycles with no expertise involved, and that's one of the things coming out of here. Almost all the successful partnerships involve a use of expertise, technical expertise, as well as the centers. But I think most organizations have a way to accommodate income or reimbursement of expenses. So in a number of science and research and facilities, there's the ability for research that is not totally open to reimburse those facilities for the cost of using that. And it's there's different categories that need to get approval through your funding agencies to figure out how you treat that income. In NSF space, there's programmatic income, and there's not, and it changes how you have to use that.
And I would just add, There's a lot of pressure in many geographies not to price below the open market. In fact, to price above the open market to be safe, so that you don't run into unfair trade practice and unfair use of public monies.
But if, as soon as you establish a price for a service, you run into the unrelated business information.
Yeah, it really varies, but I mean, I'll take, for example, in Germany, the minute that you do anything that is kind of using the center in that way, you, as the center, have to form a joint venture private sector company with the user, and you have to pay for everything through that company. You have to pay for every service that you're using at the center. You cannot participate as the center in a partnership like that, just to give an example.
So, and there, you know, if it's an academic institution, there's ways to have grants from private companies, things like that, that are not you know, that are perfectly appropriate for doing things, right? So I think I don't think we did an in-depth study of this, but I think that there are many mechanisms that people have to use. I know we get audited twice every year by people to make sure that we're accounting for things properly. But I think it's an interesting question. But
Well, one thing that you brought up in reading the report, one of the things that stood out is that in some places you can get exceptions by even to a national or federal rule by going to your local tax office. So that kind of a thing happens. So you see very, very varied patterns.
in the back, Hi, Earl, how much time do we have?
In the age of automation, one could argue. Hey, I'm just a calling guy, but surely in the age of automation, you could argue that providing the compute with some sort of tools and not necessarily all that human interface is just providing the same thing as you've always provided.
Providing the compute without the tools and the human interface is the same as what? I didn't hear what.
So I think you guys were having that tax debate, right? And
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah. And my thought was, in the modern age of automation, does it matter? Is it still actually part of the same thing? And instead of bundling human resource around the HPC, you bundle some automation tools around it, and it's the same thing.
Okay.
So, my limited understanding of the tax laws is if a company gives a donation to the university to fund some research or fund a bunch of graduate students, and there's some access to computing resources, that may be fine. But if it's just a price list for selling computer time, that's a problem.
Okay, well, we have one more and we'll stop there.
So you mentioned some of the cultural and expertise differences between industrial and scientific academic kinds of applications. Did you surface any differences in desired system capability or functionality or capacity or things like that? I'm just wondering if if there's sort of a difference between the kind of HPC capability that industry could use and the one that the scientific community could use, and if there's some risk of sort of evolving into the situation where you've got suboptimal capability for both instead of one that can be easily applied. If there's no capability difference, if there's no difference in need, then that's not such a concern. But we used to worry about whether or not you could, in certain technology areas, you could rely on industry to evolve the technology in ways that, say, the Defense Department would need to evolve certain technologies or other kinds of things. Did you see much difference in terms of how industry would use and have needs for HPC versus sort of the current directions of the centers?
You want to answer that first?
Sure.
And then I'll add.
Bill kind of alluded to that before, that there are centers that work very, very heavily with industry, like University of Stuttgart, HLRS there, which works very heavily with the automotive industry in Germany. And as Bill was saying, when they choose a system, they choose it with that in mind already. And it has certain capabilities that are superior, that are very good for running automotive applications as well as scientific applications. If they weren't working with industry, they would have gone a different route.
So I think the answer is not too much in terms of a discrepancy. So I think that there are places that have multiple systems, and some maybe are more customized for that. I think some of the industry partners wanted to have early access to more advanced technology. Others wanted to have access to much larger scales of that. But if you go back to one of the first slides, all the centers that are supporting industrial use have first and foremost their scientific and research missions, and they probably drive a lot of the requirements for the systems. And there's not a big disconnect between what industry wants and in terms of the technology. They may want it somewhat faster, but it's smaller cases. The service model is the thing that probably is more different, and at least that's my experience.
Folks, we have more questions, but we're going to be around, and we have to cut it off right there so that we can kind of stay in your own time.
Thank you very much for your attention.